Hello, I'm Ann Hoiberg. I'm president of the board of directors of the Women's Museum of California. I've been involved with the museum since 2005, and I also served as president during the time from 2010 through 2015. Today we're celebrating a very special day for American women. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women throughout the United States the right to vote. This special day was designated by Congress as Women's Equality Day in 1973. This amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." The 72-year hard-fought battle for women getting the right to vote began in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention. During those 72 years, from 1848 to 1920, 480 suffrage campaigns that included thousands of suffragists appealed to state legislators to request that they really support women getting the right to vote. 480 campaigns throughout our country. In 1919, the U.S. Senate finally passed the 19th Amendment and the ratification process began. By the time the amendment was ratified in 1920, women enjoyed unrestricted suffrage rights in 15 states throughout the country. Here in California, women's right to vote was on our ballot twice, in 1896 and 1911. Now, Susan B. Anthony thought California was so important she headed the campaign here. Unfortunately, it went down to defeat. In 1911, 15 years after the first time, it was on the ballot again. And fortunately, women were guaranteed the right to vote here in California. We became the 6th state in the Union to guarantee women the right to vote. Today, suffragists from both the national and the state campaigns have been invited to share their life story and their involvement in the suffrage movement.
Hello, I'm Susan B. Anthony, a descendant of Quaker colonists. I attended a Quaker school when I was a girl, and I started teaching when I was in my teens. I can't tell you how furious I became when I learned that as a teacher, I made less money than the male teachers. And as an activist in the temperance and abolition movement, I also reacted angrily when I was not allowed to speak at a temperance rally and 2 different conventions just because I was a woman. Those experiences helped me to channel my energy into promotion of women's rights, including equal pay and the right that Elizabeth Cady Stanton included in the Declaration of Sentiment that she presented in 1848 at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. Elizabeth was the first voice of the suffrage movement, and many people considered me the leader of the revolution of the women's rights movement. In 1868, Elizabeth and I began a weekly publication called The Revolution, which lobbied for women's rights. In 1869, we formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, as Elizabeth and I were likes to say we were quite a team pushing for women's rights. We worked so well together. I was opposed to the 15th Amendment, which read, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race." In the 1872 presidential election, I decided to test this amendment's language by casting my vote as a U.S. citizen, but the Rochester, New York officials refused to count my vote and they arrested me. The judge ruled that women were not included as U.S. citizens. I was fined $100, which I refused to pay. Almost 200 other women were refused the right to vote in the 1872 election, and I never did pay that $100. And at the 1876 Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia, I presented the second Declaration of Rights for Women, in which stated, "We ask no special favors, no special privileges, no special legislation. We ask justice. We ask for equality. We ask that all the civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters forever." In 1890, Elizabeth and I united our association with another women's association, and we became the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth was chosen to be the first president, and then I became president in 1892, serving until 1900. In California, women's suffrage was up for a vote, that is by men, in 1896. Because this election was so important to the movement, I chaired the campaign, traveled the length and breadth of the state, urging men to vote. I came to San Diego, where I spoke to a standing room only audience in the Methodist Church in downtown San Diego. And the next day, San Diego suffragists and I were invited to lunch at Flora Kimball's beautiful home in National City. Elizabeth and I continued to publish The Revolution. We co-authored The History of Women's Suffrage, which turned out to be 6 volumes. I also squeezed out time to pen my memoirs, The Life of Susan. At my last women's rights meeting in 1906, I predicted that we women would be granted the right to vote. In fact, I stated quite emphatically that failure is impossible, which finally came true 14 years later.
Good afternoon, my name is Flora Kimball. I have the unique distinction of being the most well-known woman in California in the year 1898, according to some sources. And I'm also among the best writers in the Pacific Coast, according to the National City Record. My writings address the importance of young women's ability to be self-supporting, rather than being forced to marry to be supported. I championed many women's issues such as the right to vote, equal pay, an 8-hour workday, and divorce reform. In one of my published articles entitled Feminine Folly, I lamented the time and intellect wasted by women in fashion and stressed that the need to dress in comfortable clothing without a corset that applied 20 pounds of pressure to our abdomens. I worked side by side with my husband and his brothers developing National City. The land was from a former Mexican land grant, Rancho de la Nacion, which translated means Ranch of the Nation. While the men built homes, roads, and a wharf, I arranged to have the planting of almost 2,000 trees, 75 varieties of roses and vegetables. My husband Warren and I became active in the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, a newly created order in 1867 that brought together agricultural organizations for men and women of the farming class who were seeking economic and social change. In 1879, I was elected the master of the National Range, Grange number 235, the first woman in the United States to hold this position. I wrote editorials, poems, and stories for the California Patron, the Grange's state weekly publication. The governor of California appointed me to the Board of Agriculture. In National City, my other civic duties included being elected to the National City School Board, and I helped establish the National City Public Library. I also participated or founded the several civic organizations. When Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howard Shaw came to California to campaign for suffrage, which was on the ballot in 1896, Susan spoke at the Methodist Church to a standing room only crowd. The next day I visited Susan and Anna at my home, Olivewood, for a luncheon with more than 100 attendees. I rather enjoyed writing the following. When the wife and mother make it the object of their life to wear herself out for her family, it is carrying a good thing quite beyond the bounds of reason and common sense.
Hello, I'm Dr. Charlotte Baker, a physician here in San Diego. I was born in Massachusetts in 1855 and attended medical school at the University of Massachusetts, where I met and married Fred Baker, a fellow medical student. In January 1888, we relocated with our 2 children to San Diego. Both Fred and I were welcomed into the San Diego County Medical Society only 2 days after our arrival. What a wonderful welcome! Our medical practices became busier and busier. During the early 1900s, complications of childbirth was the second leading cause of death among women. I'm proud to say that I've delivered more than 1,000 babies without losing the life of a mother. The San Diego County Medical Society invited me to serve as president, the first and only woman ever to hold that position. Equally important to me was that I considered my civic duties. I worked with the Vice Police to clean up the stingery in the Gaslamp Quarter District, and I headed to the movement to build the Children's Home in Balboa Park. I served on the City Civil Service Commission for 11 years. 9 of those years as president, I also honorary president of YWCA. My most important civic work, I believe, centered on women's right to vote. In 1911, I served as president of the San Diego Equal Suffrage Association. We suffragists urged men in San Diego to vote for one's right to vote. We then took our campaign to men voters in our rural areas. In September 1911, 4 of us suffragists sat out in Mr. Allen's touring car, decorated with suffrage slogans, and spoke to men in Oceanside, Escondido, Fallbrook, and Ramona. It took us 3 days. The roads we traveled were unpaved, rutted, and dusty. With the arrival of Election Day, men throughout California, especially in San Diego, voted for women's suffrage. After the victorious election, we suffragists registered to vote. We women turned out to vote in November 14, 1911, Harbor Bond election. The Harbor Bond passed, and a pier was then constructed at the foot of Broadway. We women voters of San Diego made it possible for that pier to be constructed in time for ship passengers to disembark and attend the festivals in Balboa Park for the exposition in 1916. We suffragists then turned our attention to ensuring that the 19th Amendment would be passed in Congress, ratified by 36 states and added to the U.S. Constitution, which occurred on August 26, 1920. We women in California had indeed won our right to be equal citizens twice, in 1911 and 1920.
Hello, I'm Ida B. Wells Barnett. I was born into slavery in Mississippi during the Civil War and was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. When I was 16, both of my parents and baby brother died during the 1878 yellow fever epidemic. I went to work as a teacher and kept my family of 5 younger siblings together with the help from our grandmother. Later, I moved my family to Memphis, Tennessee, where I received more pay as an educator. I loved writing, and soon I wrote for, then co-owned the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. As a reporter, I covered incidents of racial segregation and inequality. After the lynching of one of my friends, I became skeptical about the reasons black men were lynched and decided to investigate several cases. In the 1890s, I documented lynching in America and published my findings in several columns in local newspapers and in a pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Also, as I reported in A Red Record, I was determined to show that lynching was a barbaric practice used by whites in the South to intimidate and oppress blacks who created economic and political competition, and a subsequent threat of the loss of power for whites. A white mob destroyed my newspaper office and printing presses after my investigative reporting was carried nationally in black-owned newspapers. Subjected to continued threats, I moved from Memphis to Chicago when I met and married a black attorney, Ferdinand Barnett. Somehow, I managed to balance being a mother of 4 with my activism. As an outspoken activist, I faced regular public disapproval not only from other leaders in the civil rights movement, but also from the women's suffrage movement. I traveled nationally and internationally on lecture tours, twice to the United Kingdom, where I shed light on lynching in America. From 1898 to 1902, I served as secretary of the National Afro-American Council. In 1909, I participated in the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. I founded and became the first president of the Negro Fellowship League, which aided newly arrived migrants from the South. In 1913, I founded what may have been the first black woman suffrage group, Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club. Several members and I traveled to Washington, D.C. to march in the women's suffrage procession in 1913. It was suggested that we black women march together rather than with our state delegations. I refused and waited on the sidewalk until the Illinois delegation approached where I was standing. I then joined my delegation and marched in the front row, arm in arm with 2 white women. From 1913 to 1916, I served as a probation officer of the Chicago Municipal Court. I was militant in my demand for justice for African Americans and in my insistence that justice was to be won by our own efforts. In 1930, I ran unsuccessfully for a seat on the Illinois State Senate. Earlier this year, in 2020, I was posthumously honored with a Pulitzer Prize special citation for my outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching.
Hello, my name is Alice Paul. I was born near the beginning of the 20th century, and what a century that turned out to be. When I was a 22-year-old student studying in London, I had no idea what my life would be. But then I attended a speech by an advocate of women's suffrage. That was the moment that changed my life. Joining the British suffragette movement, I learned the techniques of political activism, marching in the streets, demonstrating, and even inflicting property damage on politicians when they opposed women's rights. When we were arrested, we used hunger strikes to drive our message home. I was clapped into jail 3 times. I refused to eat, once for 5 days. Then the authorities decided to feed me by force. I was carried to another room and forced into a chair, bound with sheets and sat upon bodily by a fat murderer whose job was to keep me still. Then the hospital doctor came in with 2 women attendants, forced a tube up my nose, and force-fed me liquid food every day, twice a day. That went on for a month. These were the very same techniques I brought back to the American suffrage movement. On the day before Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration, we mounted one of the largest demonstrations ever, a parade attracting 8,000 women marching together in the street, horse-drawn floats, banners, and trumpets blaring. But some men there for the inauguration, drunk and disorderly, began shoving us, hitting and spitting to physically bar our way down Pennsylvania Avenue, while the police stood idly by or joined in the abuse. It was horrendous. But the ruckus and indignation it aroused in the public and great sympathy for the women's suffrage movement was maybe worth it, and the DC police chief lost his job. Still, there was a long way to go, and the old method of trying to sway individual Congress members frustrated me as way too slow. So we shifted to the British tactics. The Democrats were in charge of Congress and the presidency. So we opposed all Democrats, threatening their re-election if they did not support the cause. We picketed the White House for 18 months, dogging the president everywhere he went, standing at the gates with signs asking, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" I was sentenced to jail for 7 months with 6 other protesters. I began a hunger strike, but they took me away to the prison psychiatric ward, where I was force-fed raw eggs once again. But the news of this mistreatment leaked out, and the public sympathy garnered even more support for the women's suffrage movement. By 1918, President Wilson gave his support for women's right to vote. The 19th Amendment was on its way and finally was passed on August 26, 1920, a first major step towards women's equality.
Inspired by these courageous and persistent women, the city of San Diego has this year officially declared that August 26th is Women's Equality Day.
Hello, I'm Lori Thiel, President of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. 2020 is a momentous year for women and women's voting rights, and in anticipation of this year, the League of Women Voters here in San Diego formed a coalition of community partners to bring to our communities opportunities to celebrate and educate each other on women's suffrage and the history of women's voting rights. The Centennial Celebration Coalition spawned a working group to bring forward to the San Diego City Council an ordinance called CDOW, which stands for Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. CDOW is a treaty that was brought forward to the United Nations in 1979 and has been signed by 186 nations. The United States of America is not a signee on this convention. So there's been a movement afoot over the last few years to bring a CDOW ordinance to local municipalities and have its passage maintained at a local level. So our working group from the Centennial Celebration Coalition has done just that. We have brought forward a CDOW ordinance and presented it to Barbara Bree, President Pro Tem of the City Council, and she has in turn pushed it forward to the City Council for its ratification. In the meantime, the City Council also, in recognition of this momentous year for women's voting rights, has created a proclamation acknowledging the work of the League of Women Voters and our coalition partners to recognize the momentous occasion of 2020. And I'd like to take just a moment to read the proclamation to you all and to honor and recognize the organizations that brought this forward. Proclamation of the City Council, City of San Diego, 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment Day. Presented by Council President Georgia Gomez, Council President Pro Tem Barbara Bree, Council Member Jennifer Campbell, Council Member Monica Montgomery, Council Member Vivian Moreno. That is every woman on the City Council. Whereas the year 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, establishing women's right to vote. And whereas a group of 45 organizations mobilized in 2019 at the leadership of the San Diego League of Women Voters to create the Centennial Celebration Coalition, and whereas the coalition was formed to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and to advocate for the creation of a Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women ordinance in San Diego, which will provide the basis for achieving equality between women and men through ensuring women's equal access and opportunities. And whereas the 19th Amendment did not guarantee suffrage for all women, including Native American women who did not gain the right to vote until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, Asian American women who could not vote until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, and African American and Latino Americans who suffered voter suppression until passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and extension of 1975. And whereas this centennial celebration offers an opportunity to commemorate the work of the women's suffrage movement and a democracy milestone, that the right of citizens of the United States shall vote shall not be denied or abridged by the federal or state governments on account of gender or sex. Now, therefore, let it be proclaimed by the Council of the City of San Diego that this council, for and on behalf of the people of San Diego, does hereby proclaim August 26, 2020 to be 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment Day in the City of San Diego. So I'd like again to thank the City Council members for bringing this forward and providing this proclamation for us. I want to thank the Centennial Celebration Coalition for partnering with us to make this recognition happen. And in particular, I'd like to thank two league members who were the powerhouses behind pulling this ordinance together. Rosemary Straley, who is a passionate women's rights advocate, and our Vice President, Vicki Riggs. So thank you to everyone, and I appreciate your recognition.
I'm Council President Pro Tem and Council District 1 Representative Barbara Bree. Today I'm here as an elected representative, but if this were 100 years ago, I would not have even been able to vote because of my gender. That is why I am proud to present this proclamation sponsored by all 5 women council members of the San Diego City Council. We are a historic city council with a majority of us are women. And I am honored to present this proclamation to the Centennial Celebration Coalition led by the League of Women Voters, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and proclaiming August 26, 2020 to be 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment Day in the city of San Diego. Also, it is my great honor to announce that I am working alongside this coalition and its leaders to bring forward a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women ordinance, also known as a CEDAW ordinance, CEDAW, to enact in San Diego. Currently, the ordinance is being drafted to be aligned with the San Diego Municipal Code and will soon be under legal review. It is progressing through the legislative process, and I am proud to play a role alongside the many dedicated organizations to pass a CEDAW ordinance in the city of San Diego.
I imagine our world if they hadn't tried. We wouldn't be here celebrating today. I am standing on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. I am honored by their passion for our liberty. I will stand a little taller, I will work a little longer, and my shoulders will be there to hold the ones who follow